Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a massive geopolitical and environmental balancing act that is unfolding right now in the Bay of Bengal. We're looking at a $9 billion megaproject, a pristine ancient ecosystem, and a chain of islands that geography has essentially gifted to India as a natural aircraft carrier.
To really wrap our heads around the scale of what's happening, we're going to hit 6 key areas. First, the geography of the archipelago. Second, the Malacca dilemma. Third, the Great Nicobar Project. Fourth, India's unsinkable carrier. Fifth, the ecological and human cost. And finally, the broader Indo-Pacific chessboard. Let's get right into it.
Okay, so let's start with a pretty staggering number, 836. That is the total number of islands and islets in India's Andaman and Nicobar chain, spanning about 700 kilometers across the Bay of Bengal. Now, despite this being a massive and absolutely vital Indian territory, most Indians have never actually visited them. In fact, fewer than 40 of these islands are even inhabited. So you might be wondering, why have these remote, lush rainforests suddenly become ground zero for international maritime security? Why is Beijing keeping such an obsessive eye on a territory that's located so far from its own mainland?
Section 1. Archipelago Geography, Strategic Location.
When you look at the map, the physical proximity is just wild. Great Nicobar sits just 150 kilometers from Indonesia. And even more critically, the northernmost part of this island chain is a mere 55 kilometers from Myanmar's Coco Islands, which is exactly where China has been actively developing a military facility. Because they sit right at the northern entrance to the Malacca Strait, these islands are arguably India's absolute most important strategic asset.
Section 2. The Malacca Dilemma, China's choke point.
This brings us to what geostrategists call the Malacca Dilemma. Coined back in 2003 by then-Chinese President Hu Jintao, it highlights a massive choke point. The Strait of Malacca is incredibly narrow, literally just 2.8 kilometers wide at its tightest point. With roughly 25% of all world trade and up to 75% of China's oil imports flowing through this one specific stretch of water, Beijing is deeply vulnerable. If a rival nation were to choke off this narrow channel, it could virtually paralyze the Chinese manufacturing economy. To counter this nightmare scenario, China has spent the last 2 decades executing its string of pearls strategy. They've essentially surrounded India's maritime space with a network of strategic, dual-use ports. We're talking Gwadar in Pakistan, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and their very first overseas military base over in Djibouti. They are aggressively securing alternative routes and surveillance outposts, all to make sure their trade lifelines can't be cut off.
Section 3. The Great Nicobar Project, a $9 billion vision.
So what is India's response to this encirclement? An unprecedented 72,000 crore, or roughly $9 billion mega project. Proponents of the plan argue that this massive investment is going to cement the island as a global economic and defense hub. The blueprints include an international container transshipment terminal right at Galathea Bay, a massive dual-use airport for both civilian and military flights, a huge 450 MVA power plant, and a commercial township that's projected to eventually house up to 650,000 people. The goal here is to rival major ports like Singapore and Colombo, tapping into the trillions of dollars in trade that just sail right past.
Section 4. India's unsinkable carrier, military upgrades.
Now, beyond the economics, the military implications here are a real game changer. This brings us to the Andaman and Nicobar Command, or ANC. Set up in 2001 after a post-Kargil War security review, it's actually India's first and currently only integrated tri-service military command. This unique setup unites the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard under a single commander-in-chief, which allows for incredibly rapid, cohesive decision-making if a crisis breaks out. And this is where that natural aircraft carrier idea really comes to life, brilliantly illustrating India's shift to serious maritime power projection. They're actively expanding airstrips at bases like INS Baz to land massive P-8I submarine hunting planes. They're integrating unmanned surface vessels, deepening jetties for larger warships, and deploying precision radars. It is a massive force multiplier, designed specifically to support India's broader naval expansion from 140 warships today to well over 200 by 2035. Section 5. The ecological and human cost. Severe complications. However, we have to impartially look at the severe complications involved here, because this is the absolute core dilemma. It's a fierce debate between strategic think tanks and environmental researchers.
On one side, you have the urgent national imperative to secure $5.3 trillion in trade and counter rival naval threats. But on the other side, the project requires diverting 130 square kilometers of pristine rainforest. Critics point out that dropping a massive commercial township into what is currently a UNESCO biosphere reserve severely compromises the island's natural integrity, all under the banner of national security.
To really put a human face on this, think about the number 29. That was the recorded population of the uncontacted Shompen tribe back in the 2011 census. They are one of India's particularly vulnerable tribal groups. International genocide experts and human rights organizations are warning that an influx of hundreds of thousands of outsiders could expose this deeply isolated group to diseases their immune systems simply aren't equipped to handle. They could quite literally face complete decimation. Furthermore, the environmental warnings are just incredibly stark. Independent researchers estimate that up to 1 million centuries-old tropical trees are going to be felled. Galathea Bay, the exact spot slated for the megaport, is actually India's largest nesting site for the endangered leatherback sea turtle, a magnificent species that has literally been around since the age of the dinosaurs. On top of that, over 16,000 coral colonies face a highly contested, unproven scientific relocation process. Critics argue the project is bypassing crucial environmental safeguards and sacrificing irreplaceable biodiversity for geopolitical posturing. Section 6. The Indo-Pacific Chessboard, a global puzzle. Zooming back out, it becomes obvious that this localized development isn't happening in a vacuum. It's a critical piece of a much larger global puzzle. Both nations are aggressively maneuvering to secure the broader Indian Ocean. While China establishes its presence in places like Djibouti and Myanmar, India is right there countering by developing strategic facilities in Oman, Mauritius, and the Seychelles. The Andaman and Nicobar chain is simply India's most powerful piece on that board. And India definitely isn't playing this game alone. They are actively leveraging international partnerships to transform these islands into the central node of a free Indo-Pacific. Through frameworks like the Quad and its Act East policy, India is deeply integrating with its allies. In fact, Japan has already approved a 265 crore, or roughly $30 million grant just for island development projects here. There is even talk of integrating India's undersea sensor networks with the US and Japan's fishhook systems to monitor submarine activity across the entire ocean rim. Which brings us to our final thought. How does a nation actually balance ultimate maritime security with irreplaceable ecological preservation? It's a massive clash. Securing the future of global trade against encroaching superpowers versus protecting indigenous populations and fragile ecosystems that have existed there for millennia. As the geopolitical chess game accelerates in the Indo-Pacific, this is a profound question the entire world is going to watch India answer. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep your curiosity sharp, and I'll see you next time.